Reading the Messianic Aleph Tav scriptures and seeing firsthand where the Aleph Tavs are placed can completely change your viewpoint of both the scriptures and who Yeshua, the Messiah, truly is. And it does this by giving you an advantage point in which to view the scriptures that for hundreds of years common believers have never had the opportunity to see when reading our translated English Bibles. The simple reality is, it is like looking at our Messiah in a more appropriate light for the first time, because it gives us a completely different perspective of him, with far more meaning than we have ever had. And in a way, it actually challenges everything we have perceived as truth. You see, by not literally placing the Aleph Tavs in the English translations for the whole world to see, the early English translators have actually hindered us from hundreds of years of seeing a clear picture of the heritage of Yeshua the Messiah in a more ingenuous and profound way. A case in point is that most believers view the Old Testament as just that, old and obsolete, and having very little compatibility with the New Covenant. And consequently, it has been so easy for false theology to slip in and take root and completely twist and distort our viewpoint and perspective on not only the Messiah's complete identity since creation, but it has also contributed to the loss of our identity and who we are in Messiah as well. And the fact that if we are in covenant with Father through Yeshua's blood sacrifice on Calvary, then we have been grafted into his vine and have always been joint heirs with our Hebrew ancestors that came out of Egypt and part of the greater commonwealth of Israel. And the reason how we got on this slippery slope to begin with and the loss of our identity goes back further than most believers realize today. Let's step back even further in time for a moment, for a brief history lesson. You see, when Solomon began to marry pagan women who desecrated the covenant land of Israel with their altars and human sacrifice, this eventually led to the dividing and splitting of the 12 tribes into 2 separate houses as judgment against the kingdom through his son Rehoboam, with a tax revolt by the northern 10 tribes, who consequently went off and built 2 separate temples and filled them with idols, and completely corrupted the one true faith, as explained in the book of 1 Kings. This is what led the prophet Ezekiel to lay on his side 390 days to make atonement for the house of Israel. But that atonement was rejected because they did not repent. And consequently, Father gave the house of Israel a divorce decree and scattered them to the nations by the Assyrians over time, beginning in 721 BC, and over time lost their identity and their roots. And even though the promise was to one day regather the ancestors of the 10 lost tribes and return them back to the covenant land, many believe that the reason so many are waking up today in the last 20 years, the Hebrew Roots movement has been going on, is a direct result to the coming end of the punishment that was levied against the house of Israel, known as the time of the Gentiles, whereas they were scattered to the nations for 2,730 years, which is the number 7 for completion concerning Father's judgment, times 390 years from the time they were given the divorce decree, which brings us to our generation today. And although I have greatly simplified a rather complicated historic timeline, this is the gist as to how and when the one true faith handed to Moses was originally compromised and corrupted, and why Yeshua went to Calvary to provide for whosoever would receive his atonement among the seed of Abraham in the world. Now the apostles understood their past, and it is why they asked Yeshua after his resurrection if now was the time he was going to restore the kingdom to Israel, and why Paul was called the apostle to the Gentiles, and even why James addressed his letter to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. And for the last 2,000 years that the book of Revelation has been being fulfilled, there has been a spiritual war taking place between what John called the whore of Babylon and the one true faith handed to the early believers by the apostles to guard and protect. And they did so at the cost of their own blood by the millions, even before and during the Inquisition. This gives a whole new meaning to a little leaven leavens the whole lump. The truth is, the ignoring of the Aleph Tav's importance as Yeshua's mark in the Tanakh has been simply a byproduct of the demise of the one true faith by the Roman Catholic Church fathers down through history. For the last thing they wanted was to be associated with the house of Judah because of their rejection of the Messiah. This incredibly twisted road we have been on for thousands of years has perpetuated the loss of our identity and the loss of Yeshua's identity, and is why the church is guilty of teaching, as Paul feared, a different gospel, and consequently portraying a different Messiah to a lost and spiritually decaying world. For if you remove one characteristic of Messiah, you create an idol, and consequently a deity that has never existed. And the danger in that is you wind up teaching and worshiping a false Messiah, and the gospel becomes leavened, filled with lies and misrepresentations. As a result, we find ourselves today with over 35,000 different denominations, each compromised with a different slant on who their Jesus is and how we should worship. And yet, this has been the fulfillment of Paul's prophecy in 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, and the apostasy he foretold that would come and reveal the man of sin, and has led to the great falling away from the one true faith by the papacy. The damage in that is all around us today concerning church theology, thinking it's okay to honor the Messiah with the keeping of pagan celebrations, such as Easter, which was, from the beginning of its inception in Babylon, the most elaborate and oldest pagan ritual of contacting and raising the dead, known as necromancy, whereby Tammuz was resurrected on Easter Sunday morning after 40 days of weeping, known today as Lent, and after 3-month-old infants were sacrificed and their blood used to dye eggs, with the culmination of the eating of swine's flesh on Sunday to memorialize the wild boar that gored Tammuz to death. This was standard pagan protocol for thousands of years prior to the birth of Yeshua the Messiah. And while we're on the subject of birth, the celebration of Christmas is actually the celebration of Tammuz's birthday, with the adopted worship of the phallic symbol, a decorated fir tree commemorating his birth during the winter solstice. And last, but certainly not least, the keeping of a different Sabbath on the venerable day of Mithra on Sunday. And the irony is, we have been led to believe that the Messiah actually receives and is pleased with being worshipped through these pagan rituals that the Torah strictly forbids us to participate in. Because when we do, we acknowledge our allegiance to a false religion that has removed the Jewishness of our Messiah and his Torah. Granted, most of us are guilty of committing these sins in ignorance, but the shameful truth is that the Messiah the church has portrayed to us no more resembles the true Messiah that the apostles knew and gave their lives to try and guard and protect and defend his teachings, his words, in their writings, but it actually expresses a false Messiah, whom the church has argued came to fulfill the law and consequently do away with the law. And the harsh reality is, this Messiah never existed, except in our vain and ignorant imaginations. The simple truth of the matter is that we are at a time in history where Father's Spirit is exposing the whole picture of our twisted past and who we are really in Messiah Yeshua, and how we came into this mess where we are today. And like sleepers awakening from a deep coma, Father is causing a huge worldwide awakening to the true gospel of the kingdom that is yet to be preached to the whole world, that the apostles gave their lives to guard and protect. And restoring the Aleph Tavs in the Old Testament English translation for all believers to see today is only just one more step on our road to recovery and getting back to not only what the early Torah-observant believers understood and believed, but how they practiced the one true faith for hundreds of years after the resurrection. But let me simplify this. Bottom line, if John is correct that the Aleph Tav represents the presence of Yeshua, and I believe it does, and that all creation of both the heavens and the earth was created through him, as confirmed by Paul in Colossians 1, verses 16 through 19, as well as the placement of the Aleph Tav during the creation week in Genesis, then it's only logical to presume that if everything was created through Yeshua, then everything else has to go through him as well. For no man comes to the Father but through Yeshua. So Yeshua is the mediator of all things, from creation to blessings, judgments, covenants, atonement. And the placement of the Aleph Tav throughout the Tanakh confirms this. That is what is so significant about the Aleph Tav, and why we must study this character symbol, because it links Yeshua with Father, the Yahed, throughout the entire Old Testament Tanakh. I'm Bill Sanford, trying to put the Aleph Tav in proper perspective in our day. Shalom.